I am 60 years old, and right now, my entire net worth consists of whatever loose change a local baker hands me for sweeping his floor. I live in a tiny, windowless concrete room on the edge of a neighborhood in Rio de Janeiro where the police simply do not go. On the bare wall next to my mattress, there is a single faded photograph of my old suburban house in Chicago. That house, my cashed-out 401k, the exactly $350,000 I spent 30 years grinding out as a corporate logistics manager, it is all gone, down to the very last cent. I didn't lose it in a market crash, I wasn't mugged in some dark tourist alley, and no invisible hacker drained my bank accounts. The truth is much heavier, and a lot more humiliating to admit. I wasn't robbed. I handed my money away, piece by piece, completely willingly. I traded my life's work for an illusion I was simply too desperate and too proud to see through. You might look at my situation right now, a broke, isolated American thousands of miles from anyone who knows his name, trading basic English lessons with neighborhood kids just to earn a plate of rice and beans, and assume I must be a gullible fool. But the most terrifying part of this whole story isn't that I lacked intelligence. It's that at every single step of my own ruin, I had myself convinced that I was making a highly logical, calculated decision. The warnings were always there, right from the very beginning. I just looked directly at them, justified every single one in my head, and kept walking forward into the trap I was paying to build. If you were to look at my resume, you would never peg me as a victim. I wasn't some wealthy heir with a trust fund, and I certainly wasn't a reckless gambler. For 30 years, I worked as a logistics manager for a mid-sized regional freight company operating out of Chicago. My entire professional existence, 5 days a week, was built on assessing risk, eliminating inefficiencies, and spotting anomalies. I optimized trucking routes through Midwest blizzards. I squeezed out fractional profit margins. If a driver was inflating his mileage, I caught it. If a vendor tried to hide a 2% markup in a contract, I flagged it. I was a professional skeptic. I lived, breathed, and operated in spreadsheets. That is exactly how I built my life savings. It wasn't a windfall. It was 3 decades of packing brown bag lunches, meticulously maximizing my 401k employer match, and holding on to the equity from the suburban home I was forced to sell after my divorce 8 years ago. When I finally tallied it all up, I had exactly $350,000. In the circles of real wealth, it's nothing. But for a guy who drove a 7-year-old Honda Accord and bought his work shirts in 3-packs, it was the sum total of my existence. It was the concrete proof of my discipline. It was supposed to be my fortress, but a fortress can very quickly become a cell. The divorce had been quiet, amicable, and utterly devastating in its lack of drama. After the house was sold, my 2 daughters grew up, moved to the coasts, and our communication slowly decayed into perfunctory text messages on birthdays and Thanksgiving. I didn't mind the quiet at first. I had my routine, my job, my purpose. But then came the corporate downsizing. At 58 years old, after 30 years of loyal, invisible service, I was handed a severance package, a cardboard box for my desk plants, and a firm handshake from a vice president who was 15 years younger than me. I remember sitting alone in my rented apartment that first Monday morning after the layoff. Outside, the Chicago winter was brutal, gray, and unforgiving. Inside, the silence was deafening. I looked at my future and saw exactly what American society expected of me. I was supposed to age quietly. I was supposed to find a mundane hobby, watch cable news, and slowly fade into the background of a suburban landscape that had absolutely no further use for me. The thought made my chest tight with panic. I refused to accept that my life's narrative was already over. I desperately wanted relevance. I wanted to feel vibrant, respected, and maybe, just maybe, desired as a man before the clock completely ran out. So, I approached my life the exact same way I approached a broken supply chain. I looked for a systemic workaround. I didn't buy a sports car or run off to Vegas. I started researching. I spent months watching videos on geoarbitrage, I built a massive multi-tabbed Excel document. I tracked historical exchange rates, private healthcare costs, and average rental prices in a dozen different developing nations. I wasn't running away on some emotionally driven whim. I was analyzing data. When I finally selected Rio de Janeiro, specifically the secure, affluent south zone of Copacabana, it was a mathematically flawless decision. I calculated that I could rent a solid apartment, live off the interest and disciplined monthly withdrawals from my $350,000, and exist comfortably as a financially independent expatriate. I had factored in everything: currency fluctuations, emergency contingencies, even the cost of private Portuguese tutors. It was an airtight plan. I packed my bags believing I was a shrewd, rational man executing a masterfully calculated second act. I was so incredibly proud of my spreadsheets. I was so intensely focused on the math of the exchange rate and the logic of my budget that I completely ignored the one massive variable I couldn't put into a cell. I was a profoundly lonely, aging man carrying a lifetime of unmet needs. And there are people in this world who can smell that kind of quiet starvation from a mile away, no matter how much logic you try to wrap it in. My first 3 months in Rio de Janeiro played out exactly according to my projections. I had rented a secure, brightly lit apartment on a tree-lined street in Copacabana. It had a 24-hour doorman, a modest balcony, and heavy locks. It was exactly what my research dictated: safe, predictable. I treated my new life like a corporate assignment. Every morning I woke up at 6, brewed local coffee, and opened my laptop. I tracked the daily exchange rate against my budget. I logged my expenses down to the cent. The expat forums had been entirely right. My US dollars stretched incredibly far. I could afford fresh produce, private health insurance, and dinners out, all while keeping my monthly withdrawal well below my conservative limit. I was executing my geoarbitrage plan flawlessly. I was beating the system that had tried to put me out to pasture. For a little while, the sheer novelty of it was enough. I spent my afternoons walking the iconic black and white mosaic promenade of the beach. I breathed in the salt air and watched the vibrant, chaotic energy of the city moving around me. It was beautiful. But as the weeks turned into months, a cold reality began to seep through the cracks of my perfectly engineered retirement. I was living in a postcard, but I wasn't part of it. My entire social existence consisted of broken, transactional Portuguese. I would say, "Bom dia," to the doorman. I would point at cuts of meat at the butcher. I would hand cash to the cashier at the local supermarket. And then, I would go back up to my secure apartment, close the heavy door, and sit in total silence. I would check my phone, finding no new messages. My daughters didn't call. They had their own lives, their own careers, their own families back in the States. I was thousands of miles away, completely untethered and utterly invisible. I began to realize the fatal flaw in my logic. You can arbitrage the cost of rent, and you can arbitrage the price of groceries, but you cannot arbitrage human connection. I would sit at a corner table in a cafe, tracing the rim of my espresso cup, watching men my own age walking with their partners, laughing with their friends, being looked at with respect and affection. They had a place in the world. I had a bank account and a balanced spreadsheet. The truth was, I hadn't moved to Brazil just to stretch my savings. Deep down, in a place I refused to acknowledge on my Excel grids, I came here hoping to reinvent my own relevance. I came here wanting to feel alive, to feel masculine, to feel like a man who still had value and vitality before the clock completely ran out. Instead, I was just an aging ghost with a favorable exchange rate. That specific kind of isolation is dangerous. It acts like a slow solvent, quietly dissolving your defenses, your professional skepticism, and your common sense. You become so starved for genuine interaction, for someone to look at you with real interest, that you start actively hoping for an anomaly. You want someone to break through the routine. I was sitting in exactly that state of mind on a Tuesday afternoon. I had taken my Portuguese workbook to a quiet, upscale bakery in Ipanema, trying to escape the echoing silence of my apartment. I was struggling with verb conjugations, feeling old, feeling irrelevant, and feeling profoundly foolish for thinking I could simply purchase a new life with a plane ticket. I was a man standing perfectly still on the edge of a cliff, practically begging for a gentle push. The push came in the form of a plastic ballpoint pen rolling off the edge of my table. I was sitting in that upscale bakery in Ipanema, staring blankly at a Portuguese verb conjugation chart, when I accidentally knocked my pen to the floor. Before I could bend down, a hand retrieved it. I looked up and saw Camilla. If you spend enough time as an American in Rio de Janeiro, you develop a very specific mental filter. You learn to spot the women who hang around the expat bars, the ones in the tight dresses, with the aggressive eye contact, and the perfectly rehearsed English. I was a cynical man. I was fully prepared to put up my guard. But Camilla didn't fit the profile. She was 28, but she looked exhausted in a way that I found strangely authentic. She wasn't wearing anything flashy, just simple jeans, a plain cotton blouse, and a heavy, worn-out backpack slung over one shoulder. She told me she was a nursing student, just stopping in for a quick coffee between a double shift at a clinic and her evening classes. She handed me the pen, glanced at my open workbook, and smiled. Very gently, in a soft, musical cadence, she corrected the pronunciation of the sentence I had been struggling with. She only sat with me for 10 minutes. I kept waiting for the hustle. I waited for her to touch my arm, to compliment my clothes, to drop a hint about a financial struggle. It never came. When the waiter brought the bill, I automatically reached for it. Camilla physically blocked my hand. She pulled a few crumpled reais from her pocket, insisted on paying for her own espresso, and then asked me a question that completely derailed my defenses. She didn't ask what I did for a living. She didn't ask about my apartment. She asked what the snow felt like in Chicago. She looked at me, really looked at me, with a quiet, intense curiosity. For the first time in nearly a decade, I didn't feel like a discarded corporate asset or a walking wallet. I felt interesting. I felt like a man who had lived a life worth hearing about. That 10-minute coffee turned into afternoon walks. My entire routine shifted. I stopped going to the expensive beachfront restaurants recommended on my expat forums. Camilla took me away from the tourist zones. She guided me through narrow, bustling side streets, introducing me to corner bakeries where the coffee was 50 cents and the vendors knew her by name. She made me feel like an insider, a resident, rather than a wealthy intruder. I was a man who lived his entire life through risk assessment, so I naturally decided to test her. About 3 weeks into our connection, I went to a jewelry store in the local mall and bought her a watch. It wasn't extravagant, around $200, but it was nice. A standard, predictable gift from an older man to a younger woman. When I slid the box across the table at lunch, she didn't smile. She actually looked disappointed. She pushed the velvet box right back toward me. "I don't want this, Arthur," she said, her voice completely steady. "I want your time, not your things." In my mind, that was the ultimate validation. It was the data point that bypassed every single alarm bell in my system. My ex-wife had measured my worth by the size of my annual bonus. The corporate world had measured my worth by my logistical output. But here was this humble, hard-working nursing student actively rejecting my money. I firmly believed I had found the rarest anomaly in the world, a traditional woman who valued my character, my wisdom, and my presence. She started coming over to my secure apartment in Copacabana, but not to be pampered. She would arrive with plastic bags full of groceries she had bought at the local street market. She would lay the receipts on the counter, hand me the exact change down to the cent, and spend the evening cooking traditional Brazilian meals just to save me money. My spreadsheets loved her. My ego worshipped her. I was so blinded by the comfort of being cared for that I barely registered the first tiny fractures in the picture. There was an afternoon in my kitchen when her phone rang. She glanced at the screen, her face went pale, and she quickly stepped into my bathroom, closing the door behind her. I could hear muffled, frantic crying. When she finally came out, her eyes were red. She tried to brush it off, claiming it was just the stress of her exams and some minor trouble her younger brother had gotten into back in her neighborhood. I offered to help. I practically begged her to let me handle it. I was a manager after all, My instinct was to solve problems, but she vehemently refused, saying she would never take my money, that she had to carry her family's burdens alone. Looking back, it was a masterclass in psychological leverage. If she had asked me for money on day one, I would have walked away. But by playing the proud, suffering martyr, she didn't just ask for my help. She made me desperately want to force it upon her. I wasn't falling into a trap. I was actively picking up the shovel and asking her where to dig. Looking back, the descent wasn't a sudden plunge. It was a slow, meticulously negotiated staircase, and I was the one eagerly building the steps. Once you decide someone is your salvation, your brain performs Olympic-level gymnastics to protect that narrative. You don't ignore the red flags, you actively repaint them white. You convince yourself that you possess a unique context, a special understanding that the rest of the world lacks. The first real test of this happened about 2 months after Camilla started coming around. We were in my kitchen, and her phone rang. I saw her glance at the screen, her face draining of color. She quickly stepped into my bathroom and pulled the door shut, but she didn't turn on the faucet to mask the sound. I could hear muffled, frantic crying. When she finally emerged, her eyes were bloodshot and she was trembling. She tried to brush past me, claiming it was just the stress of her nursing exams. But I pressed her. I was the capable, experienced older man. I demanded to fix the problem. After minutes of tearful hesitation, she broke down and confessed that her younger brother had gotten mixed up with a local militia in the North Zone. He owed them money, a debt of about $1,500, and they had given him 48 hours to clear it. She vehemently refused my help. She paced my living room, crying that she would drop out of nursing school and work double shifts, that she would never, ever take a cent from me. If she had asked me for the money directly, my corporate skepticism would have engaged. But her refusal? That was the hook. By playing the proud, suffering martyr, she didn't just ask for my money, she made me desperately want to force it upon her. I transferred the funds that afternoon. I didn't feel manipulated, I felt powerful. I told myself, it's only $1,500, a rounding error in my spreadsheets, but a life-saving intervention for her. A true man protects his partner. With that single transaction, the dynamic shifted. The seal was broken. Shortly after, Camilla moved her worn backpack into my Copacabana apartment full-time. The quiet, sterile space was suddenly filled with her presence, her cooking, her laughter. I was intoxicated by the illusion of a family. We spent evenings sitting on the balcony, drinking cheap wine, talking about the future. We began sketching out plans to buy a small local pharmacy for her to manage once she finished her degree. I wasn't just a retired logistics manager anymore. I was a patriarch. I was building a legacy. But reality has a way of occasionally tapping on the glass. One afternoon, I ran into an American expat neighbor in the elevator, a guy named Frank, who had lived in the building for years. He smelled faintly of stale beer and looked at me with a tired, knowing squint. He told me he had seen Camilla around the neighborhood before. He casually mentioned that she had a habit of moving in with older expats, staying for a year, and disappearing when their leases were up. I didn't investigate. I didn't even entertain the thought. I immediately classified Frank as a bitter, cynical alcoholic who was profoundly jealous of my genuine, youthful connection. I convinced myself that miserable people simply can't stand to see someone else win. I cut Frank off mid-sentence, stepped out of the elevator, and never spoke to him again. A few weeks later, another inconsistency surfaced. I found a receipt for a medical clinic on the kitchen counter. The patient's name listed wasn't Camilla's. The first name was the same, but the surname was completely different. When I asked her about it, she didn't flinch. She sat down, looked me dead in the eyes, and explained that she used her mother's maiden name for local bureaucratic records to avoid a dangerous, stalker ex-boyfriend who had connections in the local police. To anyone else, this sounds absurd. But I was living in Brazil, a country where I barely understood the language, let alone the system. I had read endless forum posts about how famously convoluted the local bureaucracy was. Of course, I reasoned, she has to protect herself. The system here is broken. I accepted the explanation entirely because I needed to be her protector. If I admitted she was lying, I would have to admit I was just another mark. My ego simply couldn't afford that reality. The financial bleed accelerated, but it was always disguised as necessity or investment. A monthly protection fee for her brother to ensure the militia left him alone. Specialized medical treatments for her mother, who suddenly developed a severe respiratory issue. Legal fees to secure the deeds to a plot of land. Camilla claimed her late grandfather had left her in a North Zone community. I tracked every dollar in my spreadsheets, but the numbers no longer represented a budget. They represented the cost of maintaining my illusion. Parallel to the financial drain was a slow, deliberate social isolation. Whenever I mentioned going to the weekly expat meetups, Camilla would sigh. She would tell me how toxic those groups were, how they disrespected Brazilian culture, and how they were a bad influence. She wanted me all to herself. She wanted us to live authentically. I stopped going to the meetups. I stopped responding to the occasional texts from my daughters back in the States, who had started aggressively questioning my rapid spending and this sudden, intense relationship. I viewed their concern as an insult. They hadn't cared about my loneliness when I was freezing in Chicago, so what right did they have to question my happiness now? I shut them out. I shut everyone out. I was burning every bridge that connected me to reality, standing in the middle of the flames, convinced I was the only one who truly understood how warm the fire was. We had been living together in Copacabana for 8 months when she planted the final seed. She started complaining about the South Zone. She pointed out the noise, the tourists, the inflated prices at the local supermarket. She told me it wasn't the real Brazil, and worse, that the constant display of wealth in the area was putting a target on my back. She said we were throwing away our future on exorbitant rent when we could be building an empire of our own. Then she brought up the land. She told me her late grandfather had left her a large plot in a tight-knit community in the North Zone, a place where everyone knew each other, where families protected their own, far away from the predatory tourist traps. She sketched it out on a napkin at my kitchen counter. A multi-story house, a high-security wall, and a commercial space on the ground floor for the pharmacy we had always talked about opening for her. It made perfect sense to my logistics-wired brain. Why bleed out my capital paying monthly rent to a wealthy landlord when I could build a permanent physical asset? There was just one logistical hurdle. When I brought up hiring a local lawyer to draft the deed, Camilla looked at me with a mixture of patience and pity. She explained that in these communities, formal deeds didn't work the same way. More importantly, she warned me that legally registering a new property construction as an American citizen would trigger a mandatory 40% government tax on the total value. 40%. My internal spreadsheet recoiled at the number. "Put it in my name," she said, holding both of my hands across the table, her eyes completely sincere. "We are going to be married anyway. Why hand our family's money to a corrupt government?" A younger man, or a less arrogant man, might have paused. A man who wasn't suffocating from a desperate need to be trusted might have asked for a second opinion. But I was intoxicated by the role I was playing. I wasn't just a discarded middle manager anymore. I was a patriarch. I was the shrewd, street-smart expat bypassing the bureaucratic system. I was beating the market. Over the next 3 weeks, I liquidated the remainder of my life savings. Exactly $250,000. I initiated the wire transfers in batches, pulling the money out of my secure U.S. brokerage accounts and converting it into local currency. I withdrew it in thick stacks of cash to fund the material costs and the labor. Every time I handed over a brick of bills, I didn't feel a loss. I felt like I was buying cinder blocks for my own fortress. I was cementing my legacy. I crossed the point of no return with a smile on my face and a completely balanced ledger. If you want to completely disarm a man, you don't just take from him. You give him exactly what he has been starving for. The first 6 weeks in the new community were, without exaggeration, the happiest of my entire life. When we moved my belongings into a temporary rental near the construction site, Camilla's extended family threw a massive street barbecue in my honor. There was music, grilled meats, and coolers full of beer. Dozens of people came up to shake my hand. The neighbors treated me with a level of deep, genuine reverence I had never experienced in the United States. I wasn't the invisible old guy. I was Sue Arthur. I was the respected elder, the provider, the savior of their beloved Camilla. Every morning I would walk down the unpaved street to our plot of land. I would stand there with a thermos of local coffee and watch the construction workers, a crew of young men Camilla had introduced as her cousins, mixing concrete and laying the foundation. They worked incredibly fast. Walls were going up. The plumbing was being laid. The physical proof of my brilliant second act was rising out of the dirt, brick by brick. I would stand there in the hot Brazilian sun, looking at the structural frame of my new life, and I would actually feel sorry for the men back in Chicago. I pitied my former colleagues, freezing in their gray cubicles, waiting for a retirement that would never feel this rich, this authentic, this alive. I had gambled everything, and as far as I could tell, I had won. I had found the ultimate loophole in life. I was so incredibly comfortable on my throne that I didn't even feel the floorboards rotting beneath it. The illusion held perfectly until about 3 months into the build. Then, the floorboards didn't just rot, they vanished completely. It started with the concrete. The construction workers, Camilla's cousins, suddenly stopped mixing it. The head worker, a broad-shouldered guy named Tiago, who always called me boss, with a grin, came to me on a Tuesday morning and explained that the price of materials had doubled overnight due to supply chain issues. If I didn't hand over another $10,000 in cash by Friday, the work would stop entirely. When I brought it up to Camilla, expecting her to negotiate with her family, her reaction was entirely different from the woman I thought I knew. She didn't cry. She didn't act like a martyr trying to protect my money. She just looked at me with a flat, irritated expression and said, "Things cost what they cost, Arthur. You want the house or not?" Over the next 2 weeks, the warm, vibrant community that had welcomed me began to turn its back. The neighbors stopped waving. The do-it-yourself street barbecue was replaced by cold, hard stares when I walked down the dirt road. Camilla herself became a ghost. She started spending nights away, claiming she had to take care of a suddenly ill aunt across the city. My texts went unanswered for hours, sometimes days. The logistical, rational part of my brain was screaming at me to audit the situation, but my ego was in complete denial. I told myself it was just a cultural misunderstanding. I just needed to be patient. I just needed to be the steadfast patriarch. The absolute breaking point happened on a Thursday afternoon. I had gone to a hardware store 2 towns over to price out some fixtures myself, trying to bypass Tiago's sudden inflation. I found what I needed faster than expected and took an early bus back to the community. I walked up the unpaved road to our property. The heavy metal gate at the front of the site was unlocked. I pushed it open and walked into the unfinished concrete shell of the ground floor. I didn't hear them at first. Then I rounded the corner into what was supposed to be our future living room. Camilla was there, and so was Tiago. They weren't discussing construction. They were intimately, unmistakably entwined against the raw cement wall. I froze. I dropped the plastic bag holding the plumbing fixtures. The sound of heavy metal hitting the concrete echoed through the empty room. They separated, but there was no frantic scrambling. There was no screaming, no tears, no desperate apologies. That was the most chilling part, the absolute absence of panic. Tiago slowly adjusted his shirt, looking mildly inconvenienced. Camilla didn't even cover herself fully. She just crossed her arms and stared at me. Her eyes were empty, stripped of every ounce of the gentle, curious warmth that had hooked me in that Ipanema bakery. I wasn't her savior anymore. I was just a drained bank account standing in her house. I tried to speak. I tried to summon the righteous anger of a betrayed husband, the authority of the man who had paid for every single brick in that room. "Get out!" I choked out, my voice trembling. "Both of you, get off my property." Tiago laughed. It was a short, dry sound. He casually reached into the waistband of his jeans, pulled out a black, heavy-looking pistol, and set it down on a stack of drywall next to him. The metallic clack against the plaster was the loudest sound I have ever heard in my life. "Your property?" Tiago said, his Portuguese slow and deliberate. "The deed is in her name, gringo. This is her house. You have exactly 10 minutes to pack one bag and walk out of that gate. If I see your face on this street again, you don't leave it." I looked at Camilla. I practically begged her with my eyes to say something, to tell me this was a mistake, to show even a flicker of the woman who had asked me what the snow felt like in Chicago. She just looked at the gun, then looked back at me. Silence. Absolute suffocating silence. I didn't argue. 30 years of assessing risk kicked in. The logistics were undeniably clear. I was an aging foreigner standing in an informal community controlled by an armed militia, with no legal paperwork, no police protection, and a gun resting 10 feet away from me. I was a zero on the spreadsheet. I walked to the temporary rental. I packed 2 pairs of jeans, a few shirts, and my passport into my old carry-on bag. I left the laptop. I left the spreadsheets. I walked out of the community and didn't look back. And just like that, at 60 years old, my life was effectively over. There was no legal recourse. I couldn't go to the local police. They don't enter that zone. Even if they did, what was my claim? That I voluntarily handed $250,000 in untraceable cash to a local woman to build an unregistered house in her own name to bypass government taxes. They would have laughed me out of the station. The most logical move would have been to walk to the U.S. consulate, admit what had happened, call my daughters, and beg for a repatriation flight back to the States. I could have slept on a couch. I could have taken a job as a greeter at a big box store. But pride is a lethal, paralyzing thing. The sheer, crushing humiliation of admitting to my family, to my old colleagues, to the world that I had been played so thoroughly, that I wasn't a master strategist, but just a lonely, pathetic old man who bought a mirage, was heavier than poverty. I simply couldn't do it. So, I stayed. Now, I live in a tiny, windowless concrete box on the very edge of this same neighborhood. It's barely large enough for a mattress and a single chair. I don't check exchange rates anymore. I don't look at spreadsheets. My entire net worth is whatever the local baker hands me, a few crumpled reais and a piece of stale bread for sweeping his floors before the sun comes up. In the afternoons, I sit on a plastic chair in an alleyway and teach basic English vocabulary to the neighborhood kids, in exchange for a plate of rice and beans from their mothers. Every night I lie on my thin mattress and stare at the single faded photograph of my old suburban house in Chicago taped to the bare wall. I think about my daughters. I think about the gray, freezing winters. I think about my boring, predictable cubicle. And I miss it with an intensity that physically aches. I don't blame Brazil. I don't even blame Camilla or Tiago. They saw a resource, and they extracted it. They were simply the predators. I was the one who voluntarily opened the cage and laid my neck between their teeth. I look back at all the signs. The crying in the bathroom. The warnings from the neighbor. The fake name on the medical receipt. The insistence on avoiding legal paperwork. It wasn't that I wasn't smart enough to see the trap. It's that my ego was so massive and my loneliness was so profound that I believed I was the exception to the rule. I wanted so desperately to feel like a man again. I wanted to be admired. I wanted relevance. And I paid exactly $350,000 to feel it for just a few fleeting months. She didn't steal my money. I handed it to her, piece by piece, to buy my own illusion. And the worst part of sitting in this dark, silent room is knowing that if I could go back to that upscale cafe in Ipanema and she dropped that pen again, I don't know if I would have the strength to let it stay on the floor.